Chapter 9. The trail down river was still unbroken, but 6 inches of light, dry snow didn't make bad going. Jim led the way, plowing a path with his snowshoes. The first few traps had nothing in them. Then he came to one that was sprung and discovered the toes of a fisher gnawed off at the jaws. Rotten luck. He reset the trap gloomily and hiked on. In the next cubby, better fortune awaited him, for he found a fine, dark mink laying frozen in the snow. It had dragged the clog a dozen yards before it caught between 2 tree trunks. There was 2 weasels in the traps below. While Jim was visiting a cubby a few yards off the trail, he heard the dogs break in a sudden barking behind him. Turning, he was just in time to see a cow moose and a half-grown calf go crashing through the thicket. Pat was crazy to follow them, and an upset sled might have resulted if Jim had not yelled loudly at the team. At his voice, Bruno whirled and growled a warning that quieted the second dog. They got to the lean-to at Long Portage well before dark. As soon as Jim had skinned his fur and cleaned up after supper, he went to bed. He meant to make a long day of it tomorrow, and they'd be starting hours before daylight. The alarm clock that most good woodsmen carry in their brains aroused him in the dark. He looked out at the stars and knew it was nearly 5 o'clock. No time to lose. By 6 he was cooking breakfast and giving the dog their feed and packed the sled. Pulling across the Portage Trail, they finally reached the lower river, and in the ice the going was faster. In a short time, Jim came in sight of the place where he had made a cache of his traps and fish bait. In the grey dawn light, he could see a circling of black wings and heard a loud cawing and croaking. A dozen huge birds were tearing at the boughs that hid the fish. They were northern ravens, larger than crows and far more destructive to the small game of the woods. Jim did not stop to shout. He brought up his rifle and fired into the middle of the flock, knocking 2 of the black robbers to the ground. Their bodies he threw into the dog pail in the front of the toboggan, and they were probably as tough as leather, but the dogs would enjoy whirring over them. Fortunately, the birds had succeeded in making off with only 1 or 2 of the precious fish. Jim loaded the rest in the sleigh with his traps and gave the order to mush on. All through the middle of the day he was setting his lower line. Some time after noon, he got to Beaver Lake Portage and crossed over and baited up the traps around the lake. With a scant 2 hours of daylight left, he decided to push on over the trail to Porcupine River and get that section of the trap line set up. It was a hard task, but he went about it with a will. 5 miles of overland travel, and perhaps a dozen traps to put in order, then 5 miles back, if he wanted to sleep at Beaver Lake Camp. He trotted the dogs between cubbies, and raced to each trap to work with quick, skillful hands. Even so, it was after sunset when he sighted the winding thread of the Porcupine River through the trees. In the fading afterglow, he swung the tired team and set a fast pace on the back trail. It grew dark early, there in the thick bush. A mile from the lake, Jim found he could no longer see the trail and fell back to let Bruno's nose do the guiding. The big dog plodded steadily ahead. He knew what he had to do as well as if Jim had been able to tell him. Once a wolf howled far away to the north, and Pat paused and whimpered, but the lead dog jerked him on. They crossed the mile-wide stretch of open ice and pulled up panting in front of the log hut. There was no kennels here, but Jim gave the faithful animals a good feed and bedded them down in the lee of the cabin wall. 10 minutes later, both of them were curled up contentedly, with their tails sheltering their noses. When he woke next morning, the boy found his own legs stiff from the long day's going. He wondered, while he dressed, what shape the dogs would be in. They had done no work for 5 months, and he had given them a pretty stiff dose of trail yesterday, 30 miles of it. To his relief, both Pat and Bruno gave him a loud welcome. They were barking and jumping to the limit of their chains, as eager as a pair of yearling pups. When the sled was loaded and the dogs harnessed, Jim led the way northward to the squaw. There was 8 or 9 miles of trapline to tend between Beaver Lake and his lower camp. He took his time, working methodically downriver, enjoying the glint of the early sun on the frost-rimmed trees. 4 ermine made up the morning's catch. He found some repairs were needed in the lower cabin, and his supply of firewood had to be replenished. Chaining up the dogs, he spent the 2 or 3 hours of daylight that remained in making the log house snug and stacking up a sizable pile of wood. One of the dead trees he cut was on the river bank 50 or 60 yards downstream from the camp. While he was chopping it, he noticed a line of tracks a short distance below and began to investigate. He found that a pack of wolves had passed this way. The trail was fresh, no more than 2 hours old, he judged, and there had been at least 4 full-grown timber wolves in the band. That night, when he fed the dogs, he found them silent but restless. Their ears were pricked up, listening to sounds too faint for a human to catch, and, hungry as he was, Bruno turned from his food once or twice to sniff the east wind uneasily. Jim knew the signs. He built a good fire in front of the camp and put on a couple of heavy logs that would last till morning. If the wolves came in the night, they kept far enough away that Jim's sleep was undisturbed. He hitched up his team in the morning, put bait and a dozen traps in the sled, and pushed on down the river. There was good fur country for several miles beyond his lower camp, and he meant to get the most out of it. New cubbies had to be built along this outlying line. It was past noon when he came out on the edge of the burnt-out track that extended as far as he could see, down the squaw. A blanket of brush had sprung up among the stark, dark poles of burned spruce, but there was not enough cover to make good trapping country. Jim was just on the point to turn around when a growl from Bruno drew his attention to a deer track in the snow near the bank. He knelt and looked more closely. The crystals were still breaking and falling from the side of the prints. Less than an hour old, probably only a few minutes. Jim looked up across the treetops where the deer had entered the bush and saw a flock of ravens circling. He took his rifle out of the buckskin case and called to the dogs. "Come on, mush," he said. Leading the way up the bank, he broke a zigzag trail through the bush, following the slim pointed tracks. It was hard going with the sled. After a quarter of an hour, they were close enough to see the ravens swooping low over something in the thicket. Jim threw off the catch of his rifle. The dogs were trembling with excitement. The hair rose in stiff ridges on their shoulders, yet they made no sound. That meant wolves. Jim stepped forward as quietly as he could and caught a half glimpse of a gray fur scuttling off through the bush. The ravens settled to their feast with a loud croaking. Half-dozen or more strides, the boy came on a dead buck, laying in a red, stained patch of snow. The black scavengers rose on heavy wings at his approach and flew off, cawing angrily. He looked around. The deer had been hamstrung and rendered helpless before the wolves had torn out its throat. It was barely dead, its eyes just beginning to glaze, its body still warm. Jim cut into the carcass and pulled the 2 hindquarters into his toboggan. "No use leaving good meat for wolves and ravens," he told the dogs. "We'll eat well for the next few days." Before he left, he examined the wolf tracks around the body. 3 or 4 different prints could be distinguished, perhaps the same pack that had crossed below his camp. They were all ordinary tracks, slightly larger than those made by a husky dog, but nothing to compare with the giant paw marks of that big lone wolf. Jim took a number 4 trap off the sled and set it with care in the snow under the buck's shoulder. The chain had been fastened to a huge cog, 6 inches through and 8 feet long. He was just about to sprinkle the pan and jaws lightly with snow when he felt a soft chill on his face. The morning had been gray and overcast. Now, big, slow flakes were beginning to fall. They would cover the trap far better than Jim could hope to. He led the dogs back to the river and headed up into the white swirl of the storm. It had grown colder, and he was glad to pull up the hood of his parka to protect his cheeks from the bite of the wind. The snow did not fall very long. By the time they had reached the lower camp again, there were breaks in the clouds overhead, and as soon as it grew dark, the sky was filled with stars. Jim and the dogs dined royally on venison that night. The cold snapped and crackled in the forest, but log walls shut it out. They slept soundly and woke to still, glistening morning of bitterly cold temperature. The first moment Jim stepped outside, he felt the breath catch in his nostrils. 40 below, it must be at least. Up to the northwest, between Squaw and Eskingning, there was an inland brook that Jim had thought worth looking over. He put what traps he had left on the toboggan and set out soon after sunrise. Almost the first thing he saw as he walked up the river ahead of his team was a lone gray animal followed by two small younger ones. Moving along in the snow-covered ice, it was a mother otter and her two pups. She started running as soon as she caught the man's scent, and the younger ones raced after her at a clumsy gait between a slide and a gallop. Jim cut into the woods at the head of the next bend, taking a line to the north through the thick bush. 4 or 5 inches had been added to the depth of snow in yesterday's storm, but still he found the breaking only moderately bad. Inside of an hour he reached the first brook and was delighted to find the banks covered with fresh mink sign. He began building trap houses and making winter sets in places where the current was too swift to freeze. The water set for mink is a rather complicated affair, but highly effective if properly done. With his axe, Jim cut a dozen alder switches and thrust them into the bed of the stream in a fence-like row close to the bank. Half a whitefish with an alder stick through it fastened to the fence, and just in front of it, on the shallow bottom, he placed a pair of number 1 traps, their springs turned inward towards the bait. At another point in the stream, he put his fence right across the current, arching it in a curve to withstand the rush of water. And still another set was made in the bottom of a bank tunnel with the bait hanging above it. By 1 o'clock, Jim had completed the short trap line along 2 of the brooks and swung his team towards home. He hoped, if there was still time, to make a run downriver and look at his wolf trap. Tomorrow he would have to start westward again. 2 hours of daylight remained when he reached the river, and without stopping at camp he urged the dogs down the well-beaten trail. A mounting excitement filled him with each mile they covered. He had a hunch, a feeling of practical certainty, that the wolves had returned to their kill in the night. A dozen paces ahead of the team, he plowed his way through the brush along the edge of the burnt island. There it was, the carcass of the buck, beside it something dark in the trap. He ran closer, gripping his rifle. Then a groan of disgust escaped him. Every shred of meat was eaten off the deer's skeleton. The snow for yards around was trampled with wolf tracks, but all the trap held was a dead raven, cut nearly in 2 by the heavy jaws. The bird must have come back first and sprung the trap. After that, the gray killers had returned to feast in safety. Jim took up the trap. It was no use resetting it, for the wolves had finished their meal. Throwing it on the sled, he started to plod the 5 miles back to camp. Tired and disappointed as he was, the boy began to recover his spirits after half an hour of steady hiking. He laughed at himself for feeling sore at the unfortunate raven. After all, you had to expect days when things went wrong. It all evened up in the end. He tried whistling, but the folds of the parka muffled the sound and his stiff lips refused to pucker properly. Then he turned to thoughts of a good supper. In his supplies from the lower camp, he had brought along a couple of jars of his mother's blueberry preserves. How about a blueberry pudding to give the day a happy ending? His mouth watered at the idea. His steps quickened unconsciously. It was late when he got back to the cabin, and almost dark by the time he had a fire roaring in the stove. But he knew just where to lay his hands on that jar of berries. Scooping out a liberal quantity, he mixed the sticky stuff into a batch of dough and thrust it into the stovepipe oven. Then he went about preparing the rest of the meal. Frozen mashed potatoes were dug out of the can with a knife and put in a pan to fry, along with a thick slab of venison steak. Meanwhile, he was warming up the dog mush and took it out to the hungry team. There was a queer sort of tang in the steamy air when he re-entered the cabin. He sniffed once or twice, trying to identify the smell, but his venison needed turning at the moment, and he forgot all about it. Soon the first course was ready. He filled a plate with hot food and ate heartily. Now for the crowning glory of the meal, the blueberry pudding. That strange, sharp odor assailed his nostrils again as he approached the oven, but still he couldn't place it. The pudding was done in a turn, golden brown and tempting. He put a big slice of it in a bowl, then went to his precious store of evaporated milk and opened a tin for the occasion. Recklessly he poured nearly half the can of it, rich and creamy, over the hot pudding. With the relish of a gourmet, he lifted the first spoonful to his lips and suddenly dropped the spoon. Vinegar! The truth dawned on him slowly. By the flickering glow of the candle he had lit too late, he looked more closely at the jar of preservatives. Instead of blueberries, he had made his dessert with pickled beets. Well, all that good canned milk couldn't be wasted. He tried the pudding again and decided it wasn't so bad when he got used to it. Grimly he ate it, to the last spoonful. Then his sense of humor got the best of him, and he lay back, roaring with laughter till the cabin shook and the dogs answered from the kennels. The end of a perfect day.